Okay, so we're now talking about even more properties of these special parallelograms, okay? And most of them deal with the diagonals of them, okay? So if we look at theorem 6.13, and you don't have to memorize what theorem goes with what property, you just have to know the properties, okay? So if you look at the first one, it says that the diagonals of a rectangle are congruent, okay? So what I want us to do is I want us to draw a rectangle. And then I want us to go ahead and mark our right angles to show that it's a rectangle. And then I want you to go ahead and draw in your diagonals, okay? So let's first talk about the fact that this is still a parallelogram. So what do we know about the diagonals of a parallelogram? Well, what we know about the diagonals of a parallelogram is that they have to bisect each other, okay? So the notation on this is very important because these two diagonals right here are congruent, all right? So this length has to equal this length right here. And so what I want to talk about is each individual segment, all right, within, all right, these diagonals. So if the diagonals are congruent and they bisect each other, look at my notation here. All four of them have to be congruent. And that's only true if the parallelogram is a rectangle, okay? All right, let's look at the next one. So theorem 6.14 says the diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular, okay? So if we would draw a rhombus, okay, mark in those diagonals. And then let's go ahead and notate the sides, okay? We don't know that these are congruent, all right? The diagonals aren't going to be congruent. We still know that they bisect each other, all right? So we still know that this has to be congruent to this, right? This has to be congruent to this. But what we know about the diagonals of a rhombus is that they're perpendicular. So that means that all four of these angles in the middle all have to be right angles, all right? They're intersecting at a right angle, okay? Now, the next thing we know about the diagonals of rhombus is that they are also angle bisectors, all right? Which means then, once again, if you would draw your rhombus, and we're not going to do anything with the sides on this one, okay? Let's go ahead and draw our diagonals. So, once again, the notation is going to be really important, all right? I'm going to look at this diagonal right here, okay? But what I actually want to talk about are the angles that they're bisecting. What do we know about those opposite angles? Well, we know that they are congruent, all right, which means then that each of these four angles, all right, around that one diagonal all have to be congruent because they're bisecting congruent angles, all right, and that's the same with this diagonal right here as well, all right. It's also bisecting congruent angles, which means that all four of these angles have to be congruent as well, okay. All right, now for our last theorem in this, it says that the properties of a rectangle and a rhombi are also true in squares, all right? So the squares are going to have every single property that we've talked about. So that's actually what I want to do in this picture here is I actually want to draw those all out. So let's go ahead and draw a pretty big square. Okay, and I'm going to make this as neat as possible, because there's a lot of information going in here. And obviously this is not going to be a great picture, but it's fine. Okay, so let's go ahead and notate everything we know about the square. So we know that because it's a rectangle, all of these angles right here have to be right. Okay, we also know that because it's a rhombus, all of these sides have to be congruent. Okay, let's draw in our diagonals. Okay. So because it's a rectangle, we know that those two diagonals are congruent, all right, which means that because it's a parallelogram, they also bisect each other, which means that all four of those individual segments within the diagonals have to be congruent. Okay. Now we also know because it's a rhombus, all right, that the diagonals are perpendicular, which means that this is a right angle as well, okay. And then we also know that because it's also a rhombus, that it is an angle bisector, that the diagonals are angle bisectors. Now, those diagonals are bisecting all congruent angles. And so now I'm going to do this in a different color because this is getting a little goofy. All right, all of these individual angles within these diagonals all have to be congruent. And what do they all actually have to equal? Well, they all have to equal 45 degrees. So this right here is all the information we know about a square. All right, tons of information about squares. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause here and just kind of keep making my way through the notes, okay?